welcome everyone. I'm Professor Jennifer Dill, Director of TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center here at PSU, and welcome to our Friday Transportation Seminar. We actually haven't had one of these in a while, so especially in person. So I'm a little excited to see you all here today. So welcome. So I'm also a little rusty. I haven't done this introduction in several months. So I'm going to advance the slide and keep going. So our transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are once again being held live on the Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important that we acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon the indigenous ancestors of this place, that we remember these communities and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Susan Handy presenting Shifting Gears Towards a New Way of Thinking About Transportation. Susan Handy is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis, where she is also director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, which is part of the Federal University Transportation Centers program. Her research focuses on strategies for reducing automobile dependence, including bicycling as a mode of transportation. She is the author of Shifting Gears Towards a New Way of Thinking About Transportation, published last year by MIT Press. I do want to give a quick preview to our upcoming seminars that are going to round out the spring term. In a couple weeks, we have Cassie Wilson, who is now 1,000 Friends of Oregon and also an alum of PSU, talking about her work on shaping communities through state transportation legislation. We actually have another alum coming a couple weeks after that, Joseph Totten from the U.S. Forest Service, talk about forest service engineering, transportation related. And then we're going to round out with Bruce Appleyard, professor at San Diego State University, who will be talking about Livable Streets 2.0. So hope to see some of you at these events as well. So now I'm going to, and this is mainly for our folks online. Our speaker is going to present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll follow that with Q&A. If you are online, you can put your questions in the Q&A feature on the control panel, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation, though often, especially with a great speaker like we have today, there are more questions that we can get to in the time allowed. We will share all of the unanswered questions with our speaker afterwards. We have enabled closed captioning, though you must click on the feature. We are recording today's seminar, and it will be available on the TREC website later on today. So you can share that with your friends and colleagues or rewatch it or etc. And if you are tracking professional development hours, eligible for 1 hour at continuing education credit. So with that, whoops, that's going to be later. I'm going to turn it over to Susan Handy. This is for you. Thank you. And we're going to switch the slides. Oh.
Yeah, well, anyway, thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of my thinking about transportation. And as Courtney can attest, I've been doing this for quite a while now. I have lots of thoughts. Most of them are in the book. And a few of them I'm going to have the time to share. But given my time in the field, I think it's fair to say, or I would reflect on what's gone on in the field in the time I've been doing this. We are at a very interesting moment, I think. So on one hand, in my own region, down my tribe in Davis, We've got a very controversial widening of Interstate 80 happening as we speak. Um, so, you know, same old, right? But at the same time, just down I-80, an hour or so in the Bay Area, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission actually raised the possibility of all lane tolling on some of the freeways in the region. That is a big change from the usual way of thinking, definitely a big change from when I was working at MTC quite a few decades ago. You know, in your own region, I think you're seeing some of this kind of old ideas, new ideas. So I know you all were talking about tolling, although then the governor apparently took it off the table, and I'd love to hear more about that. I've been following your Rose Corridor project for a long time. A widening, it appears, that's going to happen, but also some thinking about how can we use this project to communities, so traditional thinking, but some new ways of thinking added on to that. And if you look across the country, you see a lot of this. You see a lot of this traditional thinking, but also new ways of thinking. So we're pouring, you know, all kinds of money still into highway widening projects pretty much everywhere. But we have a lot of places that are also thinking about how can we, you know, how can we do things differently, and how can we really create some alternatives to driving. And it's very interesting that we're doing some of both of these things in the same place, right? So the old way of thinking with this new way of thinking all at the same time. So that is kind of fascinating, I think. And I think it's an important thing to better understand. And to understand that, I believe we've got to really kind of step back and look at how the profession is thinking about transportation and about its role in providing a transportation system. So professional thinking underlies practices, tools, guidelines that we use to carry out our work, which then shapes our policies and our decisions, which then determines the transportation system that we get. And so we can talk about this also in reverse, that if we want a different kind of transportation system, we've got to come all the way back here to a new way of thinking about transportation. And so that's what I explore in the book, which I invite you all to read. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is to take a look at the traditional way that we've thought about transportation, and then think about ways that that thinking is shifting. And again, I'm just really looking forward to hearing what you all think if you're seeing the same sort of changes happen. So I should start by defining what I mean by the profession, and I should clarify here that I'm going to focus on the part of the profession that is has some responsibility in providing the roadway system and the services that make use of that system. And of course, the boundaries are fuzzy here. We can have a lot of debate about this, but certainly when I talk about the transportation profession, that's going to include the people working for the public agencies, you know, from the local level to the regional, state, federal levels, the consultants they hire to carry out their work. Who else have I got here? Some of the professional associations that bring these people together. And I include the academics in here as well. So I am a part of this profession. I like to think that the work we do has some influence over what goes on in the actual world outside of the ivory tower. So if we think about what the transportation profession has been doing for the last century or so, you find at the core of that some key ideas. These are not the only ideas that I would say make up the professional way of thinking, But I think these are some ideas that have been particularly important to shaping what the transportation profession does. And they're also ones that I found particularly interesting. So this is what I focused on in writing the book. You can see them here. We're going to go through some of these. And really, if you add up these ideas that make up the professional way of thinking, it's really about making it easier to drive, right? So that's what we've been doing for the last century. These ideas are very much embedded in key guidance documents that probably a lot of you have worked with, the highway capacity manual, manual and uniform traffic control devices, a policy on geometric design of highways and streets, otherwise known as the Green Book. You know, if you look at what's in there, you will see this set of traditional ideas very much reflected in the guidance and the practices that are prescribed in these documents. But what's interesting is that if you look at the latest versions of these documents, the latest updates, there is some change. There's some evidence of some new way of thinking finding its way into these documents. And in fact, for each one of these traditional ideas that I examined, there's another idea out there, kind of a counter idea, that is not necessarily even a new idea. Some of these counter ideas, these alternative ideas, have been around for a long time, as I will show you. But what's different is that they've never had the same sort of credence that the traditional ideas have. For one reason or another, they've not been really embraced by the profession the way the traditional ideas have. But what's changing now is that we are seeing more interest in these ideas, these alternative ideas. These alternative ideas are making their way more into practice, I would argue. And of course, what's important about these alternative ideas is that you add those up, they are really about making it easier and safer to not drive. So a very different way to think about the transportation system and what the role of the professional is in shaping that system. All right, so I am I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but I do want to kind of walk through some of these ideas and just talk about where they came from, how they've been embedded in practice, and then take a look at these alternatives and think about the degree to which the thinking might be shifting with respect to these ideas. So I think capacity is a good place to start, because that seems to be where we're having lots of debates currently. The idea here is that it has been the job of the transportation professional to provide enough lanes to accommodate demand. And this goes way back. We started with the observe and provide approach, where we looked at where there was traffic and said, okay, here's where we need to provide capacity. And that resulted in, as early as the 1940s, plans for freeways all over the place. That eventually evolved into the predict and provide approach, where we developed these travel demand forecasting models that we use to predict where congestion is going to be in the future. And that's where we put our highway capacity. The predict and provide approach is kind of a never-ending approach, as demonstrated by this recent quote from the executive director of the Texas Department of Transportation, who said that essentially work on Interstate 35 through Austin will never end. As demand grows, we are going to provide more capacity to accommodate that demand. Well, that is essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it ignores the very well-known phenomenon of induced travel, whereby when we add capacity to the freeway system, we are not only accommodating demand that's coming from population growth, but in fact, we are inducing additional driving that otherwise would not have occurred. Induced travel, not a new idea, not a newly observed phenomenon. In fact, back in the 1920s, transportation officials understood that this happened. Yet, as a profession, we chose to largely ignore that. By now, we have lots of really good, rigorous research done by very smart econometricians that document this effect and even put a number on it so that we know roughly when we widen the freeway, how much additional driving that will induce. And my team at UC Davis, we took what we learned from all of that good rigorous research and we created the induced travel calculator. Anybody heard of this or actually use it? I see a few nods because I know some folks up here have been very interested in this. So we took what we learned from that research and created a very simple tool that anybody can use to estimate what's the increase in vehicle miles of travel for a given highway expansion in a metropolitan area in California. Caltrans has actually blessed this tool as an official approach to estimating induced VMT under the California Environmental Quality Act. So that's been, that was kind of exciting and it's led to lots of interesting discussions and debates in California, and the agency officials are not very happy with our tool because it predicts much more induced VMT than what the travel demand forecasting models predict, and they don't like that because then they're going to have to mitigate that, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of resistance to our tool in particular, but also to this idea that somehow widening highways is going to add to the problem and increase our vehicles travel. So even so, despite that resistance, we do see some, some rethinking of this freeway expansion approach. So in Los Angeles, there was a long time freeway expansion being planned there. The Metro has dropped. Said, we agree, it doesn't make sense to build this freeway. That's a big deal. It's like California to say, okay, we thought we were going to do this, we are not going to do this anymore. They just signed off on how that money that was going to go to that freeway widening is going to be spent. And yeah, there is some money for freeway improvements in here. But there's also money for active transportation and transit and some other very interesting programs that reflect, again, a different way of thinking about transportation and how we should be addressing transportation needs. Some communities are thinking about taking out freeways altogether. You probably know about the money in the federal bill that goes towards freeway removals as a way to reconnect communities that were severed by freeway building years and years ago. And of course, I want to give credit to Portland. I think you all were the very first city to take out a freeway voluntarily for the sake of the community. And, I'd like to think that nobody regrets that decision, although I guess I would be surprised if there's some naysayers out there. But anyway, again, love to hear your thoughts about that. And then, of course, rather than adding more capacity, the real alternative is to think about managing demand. And so that's where those discussions about pricing become so important. And you all haven't been able to do it here yet. I don't know where it's going in the Bay Area, but in Manhattan, it does appear that we are getting congestion pricing as of this summer. So a very different way of thinking about transportation. And instead of accommodating demand through capacity expansion, The alternative idea is that we should be managing that demand through how we price the system. And that's a more effective approach to addressing the problem. Okay, vehicles, another big idea. Right, all of that capacity that we've been adding has been capacity for vehicles. The idea here is that it's the job of the professional to maximize vehicle throughput. We measure capacity in terms of vehicle throughput. Again, the idea that we should be accommodating cars, making sure we are providing space for cars. Now, I think we all know the problem here. Vehicles are big and getting bigger. It's not just that Americans are buying more SUVs and pickup trucks, but also that every kind of car is getting bigger, even the Mini Coopers. And of course, this is a really significant safety concern. And it's not just a safety concern, it's also very spatially inefficient. So cars take up a lot of space to move people compared to other modes of transportation, especially when vehicle occupancy is close to 1. It's really inefficient. And I'm sure you've seen memes like this about just the sheer space. Well, space, there's an opportunity cost, a very real opportunity cost for our communities to devoting so much physical space to vehicles. Some communities are starting to think about maybe we can take that very valuable public resource that is our street space and reallocate it for other users, other modes of transportation, but also other uses, other public uses. So, road diets and the complete streets movement, again, reflect a shift in thinking about how to prioritize use of that space. And it shouldn't just be for moving as many cars as quickly as we can, but we need to think about other users and other uses. I think pandemic, what happened during the pandemic has shifted our thinking on this as well. That really led communities to think about, again, the street space as an important public resource and the other ways we could be using that space, whether it's for being out in the street and walking and biking, or converting parking spaces to eating spaces. And I'd like to think that we've got some kind of permanent change in thinking that has come out of this, what happened during the pandemic. And, maybe there's some evidence that we've got some new priorities filtering into our policies. So measure HLA, which is the Healthy Streets Los Angeles initiative, which was passed last fall, which now makes it official policy that when, the city is repaving and restriping things, that it has to follow the policies that the city has put in place to accommodate walking, biking, and transit. So again, some shift in thinking, and some new policy to reflect that. We have lots of great research out there that shows the economic benefits of using streets in different sorts of ways, including Kelly Clifton's work here in Portland on the benefits of bike lanes to local businesses. Adam Miller-Ball, who's now at UCLA, has done some cool work about the value of all that street space and the fact that we've had excessively wide streets, how that adds to the housing cost. So yeah, take a look at that work if you're interested in these issues. And I think cities are starting to realize some of these things and think about, we use our streets differently. That can actually be a very good thing economically for our communities. And of course, that leads me to parking, where maybe we've seen the biggest shift in thinking of all, thanks in part to the hard work that John Shoup at UCLA has done to shift people's thinking about parking. The fact that so many cities are now eliminating their minimum parking requirements I think is a very important and promising shift. Okay, so all this capacity, the focus on vehicles is really about the idea of mobility. The idea that the goal is movement. We're trying to move vehicles. And then of course the corollary to that is that congestion is bad, which is a really central idea within the profession and the public and the politicians. Okay, of course, congestion is bad. No one likes congestion. It has very real implications, costs in terms of the stress it puts on us and lost productivity and all those kinds of things. And there's been lots of research documenting all of that. So yes, I agree, congestion is bad. It dominates much of what the profession does because it is built into our level of service measure, LOS. Level of service is measured as a function of volume to capacity, which is a measure of congestion. So for a century, not quite that long, but for many decades, this is how we've primarily been assessing the performance of the system, is with respect to level of service. And that's all about moving people and reducing delay. Well, as early as the 1950s, there were observers like the urban historian Lewis Mumford, who recognized that all this focus on movement was misplaced, that the real goal we should be focused on is accessibility, meaning the ease with which you get to what you need and want. And he has wonderful quotes about, transportation is a means and not the end. The purpose of transportation is to bring people or goods to places where they are needed. And that as a profession, that's what we should be focusing on, is accessibility rather than mobility. This 15-minute city idea and the variations like 20-minute neighborhoods and so on and so forth, I think is a really nice way to illustrate what we mean by accessibility. The idea that you can, if you put what people need in closer proximity, you get what you need with less need for movement. That your access to things depends less on having mobility. And of course, this has run into some backlash and conspiracy theory sort of accusations. But still, I think it's a very powerful idea. And there are some criticisms, but valid criticisms. But it's a way to think about how we, we approach urban planning in such a way as to enhance accessibility while not being so dependent on mobility. So that idea too has been around for a long time, the accessibility idea. It's talked a lot about in the profession, I would say. I mean, you see plans, transportation plans, and talk about accessibility. They usually say mobility and accessibility at the same time. But part of the problem is that we haven't had standardized measures of accessibility, kind of consensus ways of measuring it, the way we do for level of service. So again, lots of researchers working on accessibility measures and local governments as well as state DOTs playing around with accessibility measures as a part of their planning process. But we have a ways to go, I think, before it's really sort of built into planning the way our traditional level of service measure is. California, we're seeing a little bit of cracking in this dominance of level of service as the key performance measure for the system. So now, at least under CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, so as a part of the environmental review process, the focus is no longer on level of service as an environmental impact. It's on vehicle miles of travel. And the goal is not to maximize vehicle miles of travel, it's to minimize vehicle miles of travel. So that's again, a big shift in thinking that could have really significant effects on the decisions that get made. If we can figure out how to actually implement this. So that's what everybody's working on. Okay, so that brings me to speed, which of course, that's really at the heart of all of this. We like going fast. There is some psychological work on psychological research on, how people like speed and the thrill of speed and all of that. But as a profession, the key thing is that we define efficiency with respect to speed and lack of delay, right? So we as a profession are very focused on getting people where they need to go as quickly as we can get them there. The goal is to minimize travel time. Speed has very significant implications for safety. As you all know, the faster cars are going, the less safe it is for not only people in the cars, but especially for people outside of cars. So we do try and limit speeds, right? We want people to go fast, but also safely. So we've got speed limits, and we set them using this funky 85th percentile rule, which essentially means that we are setting speed limits based on how fast drivers are driving rather than how fast we want drivers to drive. Some communities are pushing back on this, and I think Portland's got this, 20 is plenty sort of campaign to say, look, we're not going to accept that. We want cars to slow down, so that's how we're going to set our speed limits. Of course, it's hard to get people to slow down when we're designing streets for them to go fast. So this whole idea of design speed is very important, and how we think about design speed. So you can find statements like this in various guidance. Every effort should be made to use as high a design speed as practical to attain the desired degree of safety. But I think if you look at what we've done as a profession over the decades, speed is often taking precedence over safety. And I find this a really tricky conundrum where, we're designing roads straighter, wider lanes, big clear zones, that's done in the name of safety, right? And what that's doing is lowering the risk of crashing. But what it's also doing is encouraging people to go faster, so that when crashes do happen, they're going to be worse. So we're helping on one hand and making problems other. And then, of course, what do we do to make up for those design mistakes we've made? Is we do things like traffic calming, which is a way of retrofitting our streets because we probably didn't design them right to start with from a safety standpoint. So we put various devices in to try and slow down the traffic and improve safety especially for bicyclists and pedestrians. But we could go even farther, maybe, and think about, well, maybe slow can sometimes be good, right? I mean, think about the slow food. I'd like to take inspiration from that. So again, I think COVID helped. We thought about, can we slow traffic down? And if we've got slower traffic, slow streets, that makes our streets usable in different kinds of ways. Slow can be good. This picture on the right is two of my former students who happened to meet up on the train between Sacramento and the Bay Area one day, just by chance. And so, of course, they took a selfie to send to me. But, I put it in here to just make the point that the train, a little slower than driving, but not always slower than driving. Has lots of other nice benefits, because you can sit on the train and work, and you can run into old friends, and that wouldn't happen if you're in your own cars out there on the freeway. So sometimes slow is good, and maybe we should be thinking about that. It's not all about going fast. Okay, I'm not going to say much about these ideas, but I do talk about them in the book, because these are really fun. But you know, all of those ideas I've been talking about really influence how we design the system. And then these ideas are more specifically about kind of design choices. And I would say traditionally, you know, there's a lot of focus on the hierarchy and the roadway network. We're separating different modes of travel or even different streams of the same mode of travel, a lot of control. But there's an interesting sort of back and forth in professional thinking over time to sometimes think that we need to put more focus on connectivity. Maybe we need to be thinking about how to integrate modes rather than trying to always separate them. Maybe we don't want total control. Maybe letting a little chaos reign in the system could actually be a good thing. So I think with these ideas, it's not so much that we're shifting from a traditional idea to an alternative idea, but that the profession's trying to find the right balance between them, and you know how to balance these different approaches in different situations. Okay, we got a little more time, so I'm gonna do 2 more ideas, and these I feel like maybe the most difficult of all to really overcome, and the most deeply seated in the thinking that dictates what we're doing. And freedom is one of those ideas, and this is where I start the book. The idea of the freedom of the open road, you know, that's a very American idea. Car trips, the road trips, they're fun. I love them. I love a good road trip. I think that's a very real thing. But we are essentially equating, and then the idea that the car gives us an ability to go where we want, when we want to go. Yes, there is some truth to that. That's true. At least for those people who have cars and are able to drive. So the car does give us, some of us, unprecedented freedom. But we also need to recognize that the car isn't always about freedom. For one thing, cars are very expensive. There have been all kinds of reports recently about just how expensive cars have gotten. It's the purchase of the car, it's gas prices, but the story I saw this morning was also about how insurance costs have gone up, I don't know, 17% in the last year or something astronomical like that. So that's a burden. Owning a car gives you freedom, but it's a huge financial burden. And then you can see that when you look at the distribution of car ownership by income. So, well, first, very few American households live without a car, less than 10%. And then if you look at households with incomes under 25,000 without a car, households with incomes under 25,000, 25% of those households don't own a car, right? Because it's just too expensive. But what that means is that 75% of households with incomes under $25,000 do own a car, and huge financial burden. Huge share of their income going towards cars. So why do they do it? It's because they really have no choice, because that's how they're able to get to the places they need to go. So that's something we need to think about. And then I also worry that this focus on cars as freedom distracts us from the very real problem that not everybody in our society has equal freedom of movement. So, you know, this has been well documented by now that Black and brown people in this country are far more likely to be stopped and cited, both while they're driving, but also while they're walking and biking. And that's a restriction on freedom of movement. Also, somewhat documented with more work to be done here is the fact that women have more restrictions on their movement as well. from the standpoint of personal security. Sometimes very real concerns, sometimes it's perceptions about personal security, but either way, they are more constrained in their ability to move around. And so rather than thinking about freedom in terms of cars, equating cars and freedom, I think we need a much more expansive way to think about freedom as a basis for what we do in the transportation profession. And I really like this idea of mobility justice, that this group, the Untokening Collective, really beautifully articulated. I would point you to their website if you haven't looked at that before. But something that's bigger than just transportation equity or transportation justice, really focusing on mobility justice. That freedom to move, the undoing of injustices of the past, the right to have some say over not just the transportation system, but the policing and the management of the system. All right, my last idea, and then we'll have lots of questions, I hope. This one too, I think, is a really tough one to get away from. And this is the idea that I end the book with. The idea that technology will solve all our problems, that we can have our cake and eat it too. Like we can keep driving, not have to change our behavior, and everything's an electric vehicle. Yay, life is wonderful. The public loves this idea, of course, the politicians love this idea. And I think, the profession is often putting, its eggs in the technology basket as well, if you will. So I don't know that there's a lot to say here, except that I think we as a profession need to really be thinking about this, right? So technological innovation has really helped with a lot of problems in transportation. We can talk about safety, for example, and improvements in vehicle technology, safety features, things like that have made a very real difference. Air quality, our air quality problem is so much less awful than it was, thanks to a lot of technological improvements. But it doesn't mean that technology is always the solution. And most of these technologies, while they may solve some problems, they often bring other problems with them. So I'm very worried right now, and maybe you all aren't the people I'm worried about, but autonomous vehicles on the horizon, and there does seem to be a lot of just optimism about what this new technology is going to do for us. So we need to think very carefully, I think, about what the potential implications could be. And we need to be making policy decisions about this technology to ensure that it solves problems and doesn't create new problems. And if we think about future mobility, we have to remember that it's not a deterministic thing. These technologies that come along, we get to make decisions about how they fit into our society, right? And not making decisions, not putting a policy in place is also a decision. So we need to be a bit conscientious and intentional about this. So future mobility could be this, or it could be that. And we get to make the choices. All right, so yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. We have these traditional ideas very much embedded in how we are planning for and building and shaping the transportation system. There are these alternative ideas that have been around, in some cases as long as the traditional ideas, sometimes they're a bit newer. There's been, I think, some shifting, at least some increase in the importance of those kinds of ideas, within the profession. Some of the shifts have been maybe more substantial or more robust than others, but there is some shifting going on out there. To the point where, you know, maybe we can ask, are we on the cusp of a paradigm shift in the transportation field, going from the old way, making it easier to drive, to a new way, which focuses on making it easier to not drive? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I will note that I've been using this slide for a decade or more at this point, still with a question mark. So where are we? And this was a very unscientific attempt of mine to kind of depict a little bit more of what I think is going on, where over time, the traditional ideas in blue, you know, they really, the 20s and 30s were a kind of critical moment for the profession when the profession was coming into being. And so those ideas really, that's when the profession took them on and built them into how it does things. And then the alternative ideas maybe came along a little later and have been picking up some steam along the way. But you can see at the end there, I don't see them crossing, right? It's not so much that the alternative ideas are replacing the traditional ideas. It's more that we're adopting these alternative ideas on top of the traditional ideas, which is a little odd and I think problematic. And it produces what I think of as the throw everything at it mentality. This is the Marin Sonoma Narrows between Marin County, Sonoma County, and the North Bay Area, where we invested, you know, $700 and some million in building a new rail system between those counties, at the same time that we're investing $700 some million in widening the parallel freeway. So what's the it here? The it is congestion, right? So again, that's just seems to be what our main focus is. And what I worry about is that when we're doing both of these things at the same time, we're really, we're undercutting the ability of the transit investments to succeed. You know, we're not giving them a fair chance if we keep doing the old thing at the same time that we're trying to do the alternative. And, you know, the obsession with congestion, as I think about it, is troubling me more and more. I think maybe my next book has to be all about the obsession with congestion. But we have so many other problems out there, right? It's not just about congestion. There's all kinds of other things we really need to be working on. Yet so much of our decision-making comes back to that desire to reduce congestion. And I think I saw this last week, so I put it in here, you know, safety, right? So, you know, a lot of this comes back to that speed as efficiency and the priority that we give to that, which is related to the obsession with congestion, versus, you know, maybe it's finally time for us to really prioritize safety in a way that I think we've been talking about, but maybe not really doing. So we need to do some deep thinking within the transportation profession, thinking about our thinking, what really are our priorities, and maybe a little diversification could also help, as I was reminded by this story. So that's my thinking. I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to hearing what you all think. So, thank you.
All right, we're going to open it up to questions. I'll let you select and maybe introduce yourself so Dr. Manning knows who you are, starting with Chris.
Hi, Chris Smith. I help lead the organization that is suing to try and block Rosewater extension. My question is about the Surrey state of traffic model. We have an interesting natural experiment in this region. We did not build the Columbia River crossing 10 years ago. So we can look at the no builds. We had 10 years of no build where they're trying to reinvigorate the project. We had essentially two traffic models. We had a traditional traffic demand model, And then we have the investment grade analysis because we're going to toll it. The traditional model predicted continuing growth in traffic, which we believe is impossible because the facility is constrained. The investment grade analysis predicted very little growth in traffic. And if you look at what happened, the IGA nailed it. So my question is, why can Wall Street predict traffic better than our profession?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't know what models the financial people are using, but we know what's wrong with the travel demand forecasting models from the standpoint of this question of induced travel, right? That they don't account for all of the adjustments that people make as congestion gets worse. Or conversely, all of the adjustments people make when suddenly there's some new capacity. Right, and in fact, we're doing a little study now for Caltrans, but we're looking at all of the models being used by the metropolitan planning organizations in California. 18 of them, some are very small, some are very big. And so we are looking at their models with respect to, do they have the right features to be able to do a decent job of estimating induced VMT. And yeah, that's where our, yeah, it's very interesting with that calculator I talked about. So that's been blessed as a way to estimate the induced VMT from highway projects. So if you look at the environmental impact report for this project through Davis on I-80, they use the calculator to do the VMT part of the impact assessment. But then they go back to the travel demand forecasting model to do the analysis of what's the impact on congestion and what's the impact on air quality and what's the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. It's like, well, because yeah. So there's a fatal flaw right there, right? If the model was not adequate to do the induced VMT estimates, hence they use our calculator, it is not correctly estimating induced VMT, which means it's not correctly estimating congestion, air quality impacts, greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know why the Wall Street people got it. I think that would be interesting.
I'm Claire Block. I'm the chair of Oregon Walks, our pedestrian advocacy organization. I was curious about the slide that you showed with the freeway that they're not building in LA and what they are spending the money on instead. Because often we'll say, for example, if I well, instead of spending billions on that, you can spend it on, better infrastructure. And we're always told that's a false equivalency. That money is spoken for. If we don't build a freeway, you can't just build sidewalks with it. But it looks like they did.
Well, the difference here is that it was local money out of their sales tax initiative. Yes, because you're absolutely right. You can't take federal highway money. You can take some of that and spend it on other things, but most of it can't be spent on other things. And I think that, that's a real part of the problem is that there is money designated for highways. So of course it's going to get spent that way, as opposed to people, regions saying, well, we don't want any of that money. Politicians aren't going to get reelected if they say we're not going to take that money, but they can't spend it on other things. So LA Metro, has a big county, so their sales tax initiative brings in tons of money that they have a lot of flexibility as to how to spend. And at least in California, we do a lot of those sales tax initiatives to do that, local option sales taxes here. And a lot of that money is still going to highways. But depends on the region and what their priorities are, but they have that flexibility. And there's work being done on trying to understand better this whole financing system and how it's contributing to the status quo, the inability to try something. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan, such a great comprehensive presentation. I wonder if you can, picking up on that, I'm Rebecca Sanders. I run a small pedestrian bicyclist safety consulting firm here. And Wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the funding from the federal level. So we have Transportation Secretary Judge who seems to really get it. And also we have all of this other politics that come into play, such that this latest infrastructure bill, while being perhaps the most progressive in some ways, also included so much money, additional money for highways. And it just feels like we are still talking out of both sides of our mouths. And then we have, you know, Chair Homendy saying to the DOT leaders, I know who you are when you plan for increased fatalities, but with zero teeth or any power to do anything. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, how we're stuck sort of in a vortex of funding and lack of accountability or lack of willingness to impose accountability.
Yes, this is where we need some political scientists getting interested in transportation and how policy gets made in transportation. Yeah, I don't think I understand it well enough to say a lot about that, but I do want to point you all to my former student, Amy Lee, who finished her dissertation last summer. And if you just Google Amy Lee dissertation, I think you find it. She looked at the situation in California and did in-depth interviews with more than 50 officials involved in some way in decisions about how we spend our transportation money. And yeah, it's just fascinating because there's just so many different themes she identified that just explain why it is so difficult to do things differently, from very short-term thinking where politicians as well as agency folks feel like they have to do something now because the public is demanding it, even though they understand that this is a short-term fix. That, you know, in 5 years, congestion will be just as bad. So they spend, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars on highway widenings, knowing that that's a temporary fix. And then there's the, of course, the highway building industrial complex, which has a lot of political power. The labor unions have a lot of political power. And it's easy to say, well, if we were building transit instead of highways, there'd still be those construction jobs, but it's different companies and different workers. Some people are using equity as an argument for widening highways. And it's tied to our affordable housing problem. So Highway 37 at the north end of the bay, you know, there's a big push to widen that. And the argument is all those low wage workers working in Marin and Sonoma can't afford to live in Marin and Sonoma. So they have to commute from, you know, Vacaville and out my way. So we need to widen the freeway so their commute isn't so miserable. And that, you know, it's a great example of the money just not going to the right place, because the obvious answer is, well, what if we took all those millions of dollars and invested that in affordable housing? Isn't that the right way to solve the problem? But we can't do it with the way the money works. Anyway, so point you to Amy Lee's dissertation if you want to understand some of that. But then the federal level is a whole other story.
I'm gonna insert, we have a lot of great questions from our web viewers that we're not gonna be able to get to them all. But I'm gonna, first of all, a comment came in related to Chris's question about sort of the difference in models. Wall Street can't afford to get it wrong.
Yeah, but how do we do with it?
Yeah, so different incentives, but I'm gonna, again, great questions on the web. I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but I'm gonna share this one. To what extent is lived experience critical in shaping professional thinking? For example, do you have to be a bike commuter in order to understand how to design high quality, low stress bikeways? So more broadly, that personal lived experience.
I think personal lived experience is very important. Doesn't mean you can't do a good job on things you don't necessarily have a lot of lived experience with, I would say. But I think having that lived experience can make a big difference. And I think about my biking in Davis. There's so many, which has great biking instructor. Anybody been to Davis? You know, we do pretty well. But there's some, little pieces in the network, it's like, man, this just doesn't work, if they just did this rather than that. And, it makes me think that the people doing the bike planning for the city are not necessarily riding the routes I ride, because they would then identify the problem and realize there's an easy fix and it would get fixed, but maybe.
I mean, there's lots of examples of transport members who never ride trains.
Yes. Okay, question in the room. Cy,
You look like you're gonna.
Cy Adler, retired member of the PSU faculty. Your characterization of the profession and transportation professional. So Mel Weber was my dissertation committee chair.
yes.
And the big deal, 1950s into the 1960s, relations between traffic people, transportation engineers, and urban planners.
Yes.
So it didn't seem like in your presentation here today, having a chance to read the book, the land use dimension of what's going on here. And then what's it like with regard to the relationships between your transportation professionals and urban planners?
Yes, that's it's a bit of a sticky question. So as I say in the preface or introduction, I can't remember which, I didn't want to get into the engineers think this way, the planners think this way. Because I didn't want to, I wanted to stay focused on the ideas. And it is true that not all engineers think the same way. Engineers think the same way. So yes, I really tried to stay focused on the ideas, not worry about who holds which ideas. But somebody should do that work. And then of course, urban planning versus it's tricky because so many transportation people are trained in engineering, and then there are transportation people who come out of the urban planning realm, but they are just a subset of urban planning, which is this whole other thing. And then there are people who come into transportation from completely different backgrounds as well. So yeah, disciplinarily, it gets a little tricky. And then the land use thing, that was one of the other reviewers of the book, when the press put it out for review, said, well, you're not talking about land use. I thought you were a land use person. And yeah, I did end up really focusing on transportation in this book, but I feel like land use is everywhere in it, because you can't talk about transportation without land use. So I really do focus on how we're making decisions about transportation. But I didn't mean to say that the land use decision-making isn't important as well.
Well, it's
connected.
in terms of the models that are used to come up with travel demand numbers and then capacity related issues.
Right, you plug in those assumptions and let's get those right.
We are a little bit over time, but I'm going to throw out one more question from our web-based viewers, and hopefully thinking into the future a little bit. Would you comment on the value of scenario planning and helping to forecast these alternative mobility futures? How about that?
Well, that sort of ties into what I was just talking about. Yeah, I think scenario planning is a very good thing to be doing. These demand forecasting models, we know they have limitations. There's a lot of effort, time, money spent on trying to make them better and more accurate and all of that. And maybe that's not how we should be thinking about it. Maybe we should accept that some of these forecasting tools are giving us a rough estimate, right? They're not predicting the future. They're not doing anything very precise or accurate, but they can help us compare different scenarios in a reasonable way. And we might not know exactly how much more traffic there's going to be in this scenario versus that scenario, but we know kind of the general direction of things. So yeah, for me, I feel like that's the way we should be using the models, is to do that kind of testing. But the problem is the limitations of the models to be able to do that, because for one thing, in fact, we're running a model now for one of our research projects, 24 hours to run it. You know, so that just makes it hard. And then they don't represent some of the stuff we're talking about very well either, like bicycle and pedestrian investments. You know, some kinds of transit projects and things like that. So yes, good in theory. We need to figure out the right modeling to really support that, I would say.
All right, well, I need to unfortunately bring us to a close. Want to thank Dr. Handy again. And let's see, for those of you joining remotely, after the webinar ends, there's a brief survey. We really appreciate your feedback. And again, thank you. And all of you for showing up in person.